It's been called the second brain. From anxiety to Alzheimer's, there's increasing evidence that changes in the gut microbiota can alter brain psychology and behavior. Join us for an in-depth discussion on the gut-brain axis and how it impacts the health of your patients.
The second brain, it refers actually to a collection of neurons that are clustered together within our gastrointestinal tract, including in our gut and our intestines. It consists of estimates are like 200 to 600 million neurons. So there's actually more neurons in the gut than there is in the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system. These neurons tend to be clustered together in these little networks that are called plexus, but they connect with many other structures of the body. So really the second brain, it refers to this huge collection of neurons we find in our digestive tract. Now, a really interesting part of this story for me is that a large part of the structure and actually the neurochemistry, the signaling of this second brain is similar to what we find in our first brain, in the brain in our head. We have a lot of the same kind of structures. There's over 30 different neurotransmitters or signaling molecules found in the enteric nervous system that are also found in our brain. So there's a lot of complexity, a lot of signaling that's going on in this second brain. Another part of the story that's really interesting is that we used to think that this second brain was only involved in digestion. It only had a local function. It was only involved in sort of digestion and maybe the rhythmic control of the intestines to help move food through the intestines. Now we know it does a lot more than that. In fact, it communicates with our brain. And so that's the sort of the idea of the gut-brain axis and this connection between the gut and the brain. This idea of the enteric nervous system as a second brain was actually established quite a long time ago, actually in the early 1900s. But what's the new concept is that the microbiota, so in particular, we tend to think of the bacteria, are a very important part of this communication pathway between the gut and the brain. And so the gut microbiota need to be included as this way that our two brains interact. They produce different signals, they transduce different signals. They're really important in communication throughout the body. And I think that's really good news for doctors of integrative medicine, particularly naturopathic doctors, because we really are experts in being able to support healthy gut, to support healthy gut microbiota. And that can potentially influence your mental health, which is what we're going to talk about today. So that's, in a nutshell, the second brain, the enteric nervous system, and the importance of actually thinking of not just the gut-brain axis, but the gut microbiota brain axis.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for expanding upon that. So, Dr. Pruski, Dr. Lishai just mentioned about the gut microbiota. How would you say, what are some of the pathways that the gut and the brain communicate with one another?
Well, as you know, the gut has such an integral role to play with digestion, immune cell function, endocrine function, and neurotransmission. But what I find fascinating is that, as David said, is that it's sort of another brain, and it produces all sorts of chemicals that can directly interface with the brain that are neuroactive, that produces even neurotransmitters. And then the question is how much of these get into the brain. But what I think is most fascinating is we know there's this bidirectionality between our gut and our brain. And we also know that one of the most important nerves get sort of interacted with between this gut-brain axis, and we call that the vagus nerve. And that, to me, is probably where research is going to show a lot of evidence between this brain-gut axis or this gut-brain axis, because when the gut produces chemicals that directly hit the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve sends signals into the brain, it can calm the brain. It can bring a parasympathetic tone to the whole biology. And as you can imagine, most mental health disorders are characterized by a lot of stress and by a derangement of our sympathetic system relative to our parasympathetic system. So anything that can encourage vagal tone, and I do believe that's going to come from the gut, is going to have a broad influence on psychiatric disorders and mental distress.
And Dr. Weiss, I know you specialize with digestive disorders. So what are some of the dysfunctions that you've seen with the gut that can adversely impact brain function? Things such as, inflammation, dysbiosis, candida overgrowth, things of that nature.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of times you're going to see, I see in clinic anyway, there's a connection between people that have inflammatory bowel disease, and there is going to be a connection with respect to some mood disorders in some cases. But inflammatory bowel diseases in particular do affect the microbiota. And that has a role to play, just as we had already heard from Dr. Prowski and David about how it alters the actual the makeup of the microbiome. And so things like Crohn's or colitis, ulcerative colitis, and in cases of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where there is an overabundance of bacteria in the wrong part of the GI tract, that starts to have a high amount of fermentation. And so we see a lot of dysbiosis. And even in cases like I see a lot of children that have anxiety in clinic, and I would say that almost in all cases, there is a connection to the gut. And so when you start addressing the gut, you start to see improvements with their mental health. So that the other big area that we've started to learn about just in the last couple of years is when people have traumatic brain injuries, so concussions. Where I live in a community where there's a lot of sporting activities, and it's a smaller community, so it's a major part of it, and kids are getting concussions all the time. And it's something that needs to get addressed, because usually we see that when a person has a traumatic brain injury, you'll start to see what we would call leaky barrier in the intestinal cells. And so now we start to see the immune system starting to react to things that otherwise it wouldn't have, because the barrier was intact. So those are some of the things that we see in liver dysfunction, where there's a decrease in bile acid, or just a stagnation in the liver of bile acids. There's a variety of different ways that the microbiota is affected.
I hope you enjoyed that highlight from a recent program on Nutramedica. If you want to get access to our full-length shows and live interactive events, you'll need to register as a healthcare professional at Nutramedica.org. To stay up to date with our latest programs, go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell. We'll see you soon at Nutramedica.org.